This morning I'm actually going to be turning to a book in the Bible that I enjoy a great deal. It's the book of Ruth. And a long time ago, it seems like another lifetime ago, I had to take Hebrew in order to become a pastor. And when I was taking Hebrew, I ended up taking 4 semesters of it. And I enjoyed it, and we got into translating Hebrew poetry. We got into translating some of the Hebrew Mishnah, which actually comments on the Bible. And one of the other things that we translated was the book of Ruth. We ended up having to translate this entire book from the original language. So now when I pick it up and I read through it, I remember some of those memories I had of learning the original language. And I've truly grown to appreciate this story. This morning we're going to look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. Listen now for the word of our Lord. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and sons and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name, Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem of Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi turned and said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Lord, as we come together this morning and we listen to the words of Ruth, we hear words that we hear usually in the context of a wedding, when 2 are becoming 1, when a new reality is born. As we come together here this morning, we long to hear what these words mean for us in our context, in our time. Help us to understand, Lord. and to hear your living word. Amen. As you will recall, back in September, we began a journey through the Bible. We began by looking at how it is connected together and kind of the threads that weave it into one story. We started with creation, and then we moved on from creation on into the family of Abraham and Sarah and their descendants. We traveled with that family lineage into Egypt, where their very existence was threatened, and in their cries for help came Moses. And we read a little bit about his story as well. Well, we know that they escaped from Egypt and they journeyed through the wilderness, where they end up getting to know God a little better, and they learn how to live by God's laws. But now, as we see in our text this morning, the people have settled in the land that is known as Israel. But the people aren't united anymore. They've actually ended up dividing into their separate tribes. They're threatened now by surrounding people like the Canaanites and the Philistines, and we hear lots of their battles, and even the Moabites. That's important because where are they? Where's the context of this story? In Moab. Well, in order to fight off their adversaries, certain people called judges arise in the land, and they unite some of the tribes together to fight off their common adversaries. But the tribes, they are struggling in their relationship with God, and they end up fighting against each other at times, almost entirely wiping out the tribe of Benjamin. At the end of the book of Judges, which is right before the book we read today, at the end of the book of Judges, it tells us it is a time when people did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, everyone is looking out for themselves and what is right for them. There's not as much concern for the well-being of others in the time of the judges. Well, in the midst of this, we're introduced to this story of Ruth that takes place in the context of the judges. Actually, as you can see, it's not just about Ruth, but it's about her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi is from Bethlehem. We find that in the first few lines there. And what's interesting is that the name Bethlehem, as I can remember learning it in Hebrew, actually means house of bread. And if you think about it, what is it that causes them to leave their home? What is it that causes them to leave Bethlehem? Well, times are so tough that even the house of bread has nothing to offer them, has no food, no nourishment for them. And so they go in search of food. Well, they go to a very unlikely source. They end up going to Moab. And if you recall, I was telling you a little bit of history about these times. They fight with the Canaanites. They fight with the Philistines. They fight with the Moabites. This is a country that is at odds constantly with Israel. And in this place, they would be strangers in a strange land, most likely looked upon with suspicion by everybody who lived there. Well, Naomi, she has children. She has 2 sons, but in just a few short verses at the beginning of what I read to you, we learn that Naomi's husband dies. Her husband and her 2 sons that she's left with, who have gone to marry Moabite women, have also died. Well, here's Naomi now. She's a foreigner, at least where she is now, surrounded by people who don't share her religion or share her ways. Naomi finds that there is once again food in Bethlehem, so she sets her mind to go back to where she came from, where she feels that she has nothing in Moab except misery. Well, as she begins to set out, her daughter-in-laws, they choose to set out with her. But she turns around and she says to them, "Go back." She tells them that her life is hopeless, and if they stay with her, their lives will be just as bad as hers. That's translating what she's saying to them. She ends up thanking them for their kindness and how they have dealt with her, and how they have dealt with her husband's death, and how they have dealt with her son's death as well. But now she tells them that there is nothing more for them to do, but for them to go back to where they came from. She even prays that God will be just as kind to them as they have been to her. And this is where I want to stop for just a moment in the story. If you recall, I was telling you that this is the time of the judges, a time known for when people only looked out for their own well-being. A time when people did what was right in their own eyes. But that's not the case in this family. In Naomi's prayer, we hear her ask God to be just as kind to her daughter-in-laws as they have been to her. The word that she uses for kindness is a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word it's kind of hard to pronounce, but it's chesed. You have to get kind of that funny sound in the back of your throat. Chesed. Well, chesed, even though it's hard to pronounce, is actually a beautiful word. Chesed is the word that is used throughout the Psalms to refer to the character of God. It's actually translated as God's everlasting love, God's unending faithfulness, God's enduring grace and mercy. Every time you see that throughout the Psalms, the word is chesed. Chesed is not a random act of kindness that you show to a stranger, but it's actually a kindness that you show to someone as part of your devotion to them, to show how devoted you are to seeking their wellness, not just in the short run, but forever. And here we see the daughters-in-law of Naomi showing this chesed to her. They are intent upon seeking her well-being for the long run. And she knows it. But Naomi, she also seeks the well-being of those that have been so kind to her. As she says, she believes she has nothing more to offer them, nothing more to give them. She's just an old woman now, and she believes they would be better off just to let her go and build a new life for themselves with a new family, where the prospects would be much better. Well, after sharing tears with one another, and I see that again as another sign of the devotion that they have to one another. Well, after the tears that they share, one of the daughters-in-law ends up listening to the wisdom of Naomi, and she turns back for Moab. One of the things I think it's important to understand is that her decision is not an easy one. And the reason why I say that is, if you remember, she's a Moabite, and she's married an Israelite. And even if her family can get past the fact that she has married outside of their people and outside of their religion, the community may not be as understanding. And not only that, but she's now in her mid-20s and without any children. That doesn't mean a whole lot to us in our day and time, but back in that time it meant a lot. She's past the age that most men would be looking for a husband. For a wife, sorry. And since she hasn't had any children, she'll be thought of as barren, which wasn't very appealing in those days either. She didn't make an easy decision in turning back. And that's the point I want us to understand. But at least in staying in Moab, she knows the ropes. She knows what to expect. She knows the people around her, more so than traveling to a foreign land where she would be a stranger and perhaps even seen as an enemy. It seems that she has made the practical decision, the better decision. Naomi prays that God will look out after her and care for her just as she has done for Naomi. And she believes that Orpah will be better off in Moab than going to Israel. You can understand a little bit why. But why then did Ruth not go back? You know, we're not told her reasons. We don't know anything about her, really. All we know is that when she goes to Israel, she's going to stick out like a sore thumb. She's possibly going to be scorned by the community for being a Moabite. But she is determined, nonetheless, in her commitment to care for Naomi and to see that decision through. She is so determined that she is willing to give up everything. Her people, her religion. And as it says in here, you don't quite understand it in the English translation you just read or heard. She is even willing to give up her life. She's willing to sacrifice everything for Naomi's well-being, to show her chesed, kindness, to a woman who believes that she has nothing. What a contrast to the setting of the time of the judges. In a day and age when everyone is just looking out for themselves, here's an example of people living by another way. Living out of their love and their concern for each other. Looking out for others more so than even themselves. You know, in this story, it's Orpah who does the practical thing. She's the one who finally listens to the pleading of her mother-in-law and goes back to her family and to her people. Even Naomi is doing the practical thing in this story as we read, by going back to her own people, by returning to what it is that she knows and where she will be accepted. You know, it's bound to be tough. She'll probably have to beg for a living, but at least she'll be among people that she grew up with and who may have greater pity for her. You know, in our day and age, it's actually Orpah and Naomi who would most likely be praised for doing the sensible thing, is it not? For seeing the truth, for seeing the reality in which they found themselves, and what needed to be done, and having the courage to do it. And I think quite often we can identify with Orpah and Naomi for making the choices that they did. They made the practical decision. You know, the hard part is that sometimes when the going gets tough and we are offered an out, how often do we end up taking it? But then there's Ruth. She sacrifices everything, even her own life if need be, to take care of Naomi. As the story goes on, Naomi, she ends up actually changing her name when she gets back to Bethlehem. She says, "Don't call me Naomi anymore." She says, "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because she believed her life was just a bitter reality. She believes she has nothing. She believes that her life is just hopeless. And in her hopelessness, Ruth actually becomes her hope. It's Ruth who actually goes and she scrounges for food, despite the danger to herself. It's Ruth who happens upon the field of a relative of Naomi's, who ends up dealing with her in an unexpected way, showing a stranger and a foreigner chesed, kindness. He looks out for her. He offers her protection and eventually even marries her. And all the while, Ruth sees to it that Naomi is cared for. Everything that Ruth receives, she makes sure that it passes on to Naomi. She even gives her firstborn son to Naomi, who becomes his nurse. And as you probably know, Ruth ends up becoming the great-grandmother of David, who becomes the king of Israel, who ends up finally uniting all of the tribes together as one. But as you also know, her lineage continues throughout the centuries to another king, the King of Kings. It can be traced all along to Jesus. And through Jesus, we again see someone who doesn't always do the practical thing. Instead, he risked everything to once again bring hope to those that have no hope, to those that the world has given up on. You know, as I read the story of Ruth and I reflect upon how similar she is to Jesus in her heart, I can see why this story has survived so many ages. She did the impractical thing and risked everything simply for the well-being of an old woman who could offer her no hope of a future. But through that act of love, she became the blessing that Naomi needed. You know, often when I read these stories, I'm often asking myself, what is the message for me? Where do I see myself in this story? Or how does this story relate to my own life? And one of the questions that came out of reading this for me today is, you know, who is the Naomi in my life? Who is it that we know that has given up on hope in this world? Who is it that sees himself as having no future? You know, if we can identify the people in our lives that are like that, then perhaps we can see where it is that God is giving us the opportunity to let the light of Christ shine through us, to do the impractical thing that we see Ruth doing, to look out not for ourselves but for the well-being of another, even choosing to sacrifice our own comfort and security to show our commitment, to show chesed, kindness, until the Naomi that we identify in our lives is able to find hope once again through us, through those that God has placed in their lives. I challenge you to look at this story even further. Look at the characters in this story. See where it is that you find yourselves in this story, and where you find the people that are described there in your lives. And see what God has to tell you today. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.